Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm pleased to welcome you to the launch event of the new 6-year research project, Societies at Risk, the Impact of Armed Conflict on Human Development. My name is Branka Panic, and I'm a founder of AI for Peace and a non-resident fellow at the New York University Center on International Cooperation, and I will be moderating today's event. Societies at Risk is a multidisciplinary research program led by Professor Håvard Hegre at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. And understanding the conflicts and impacts of conflicts has been a subject of multiple academic fields, but the research has been done mostly in fragments. So understanding the full impact of armed conflict still remains a challenge. And this multidisciplinary program, Societies at Risk, is now facing this challenge by bringing together scholars from different fields, from economics, epidemiology, political science, conflict research, all of them to study the impacts of armed conflict in much more detail and comprehensiveness than earlier studies. So during today's event, we will present some of the research that led to this program, and we will also have an opportunity to hear what this group of researchers will be working on over the coming years in the framework of Societies at Risk. So as previously announced in the agenda, the event will open with a keynote address delivered by Andrew Harper, Special Advisor for Climate Action to the High Commissioner for Refugees. And we will then give the floor to the project researchers, starting from the leader, Håvard Hegre, Hans Müller, Johan von Schrieb, Paula Vesco, and Jonathan Hall, to learn more about the upcoming project, the current research on impacts of armed conflict, the link to the violence early warning system views, I'm sure familiar to many in the audience. And we will hear more on how findings from this specific project can help inform high-stake decision-making and anticipatory action. So once again, welcome to our guest speakers and welcome to our audience as well, both in person at Uppsala University. You can see the room in a little screen for our online audiences, and welcome to our online Zoom audience as well. As this is a hybrid event aiming to be as inclusive as possible to both in-person and online participation, I will just introduce a couple of housekeeping rules. So we will start with presentations of our respective hosts and guests, and then we will have a questions and answer session at the end. Once we enter the time for Q&A, our Zoom audience can raise their virtual hand and take the floor. And then our in-person audience will also have a chance to engage in the second round of Q&A. So bear with us as we navigate between our virtual and physical spaces. Your full participation is very welcome and appreciated. And just a quick last note from my side that this event will be recorded and recording made available for those who were not able to join us at the launch today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker. Welcome to Andrew Harper, Special Advisor for Climate Action to the High Commissioner for Refugees at the United Nations. Andrew is responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight, and expertise to shape UNHCR's response to the climate emergency. And prior to his current tasks, he headed the Innovation Service and was responsible for leading and coordinating the international response to the Syrian crisis in Jordan. Andrew has over 30 years of experience working with people forcibly displaced by conflict and disasters in various field locations and headquarters with UNHCR, OCHA, and Australian Embassy. So Andrew, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Branka, and thanks to all my friends at Uppsala and Views and elsewhere for this opportunity to make presentations. So don't be too worried. I've got a time limit of 9 minutes, and then I have to catch a plane, so I won't be extending too far. But I think just while I'm sort of sitting here and sort of looking out above the computer at the hills in Kigali in Rwanda, just across the valley here, there's a memorial for 250,000 people who were killed. One of up to 800,000 people who were killed in the 1994 massacre. And when you go to the memorial and you see the amount of, obviously the devastation and the human tragedy, but you also go through the timeline of what led up to the events. And then you sort of question about like, what could we have done better? And that's 28 years ago, and we're here during the 28th year commemoration. But we're also here in order to, I'm going around the country looking at refugee camps. We've got refugees from Congo, from Burundi, as far afield as, from other parts of the Sahel even coming to here. And we've got to be able to demonstrate that we've learnt from the past and we can do so much better. And so this is why I'm certainly very much interested and supportive of this project, because using data, using evidence, using this interdisciplinary approach in order to support action to prevent this in the future is so important. It's not important, it's just critical. So there's three key messages that I would like to push forward. And then again, I'll be wrapping it up within 7 minutes now. But one is that early warning systems and anticipatory approaches do help us get ahead of the humanitarian crisis. And we've got no alternative but to shift from being reactive to being proactive. And this is no more important than from a UN humanitarian / protection agency. It's no longer acceptable to anyone that we wait on the other side of a border for people to cross a border in search of protection. We have to be able to identify what are the key vulnerabilities that are stoking potential violence and seeking to mitigate those triggers before it actually happens. So crises can be averted if we anticipate and act in time. The longer action is delayed, the more complex and costly the demands will be on governments and other actors from across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And more importantly, more costly it will be on the persons who are being impacted by that violence. Conflict and disaster prevention and preparedness for potential displacement is essential to reduce, anticipate, and manage climate and security risks to climate vulnerable populations. About a third of the people around the world are currently not covered by early warning systems, but in Africa, the problem is greater, with about 6 in 10 people lacking such warnings. Advances in science and technology and stronger coordination mean that we can not only reduce the impacts of climate change on people's safety, dignity, and security, but also avoid ballooning costs. This requires better data that leads to more informed action. Data and the ability to forecast risks are crucial to ensure that early warning systems remain effective, which consequently helps to keep actions well informed. And so that's the first key message. We must be investing more in early warning and anticipatory approaches. The second message is to fully understand and anticipate the occurrence and severity of future humanitarian crises. We need a consistent theoretical methodological framework that allows us to capture the key drivers of such crises in a consistent manner. Armed conflict and climate extremes combined with high societal vulnerability are some of the most important drivers, as they can destroy or even obliterate the livelihoods of entire populations. Especially interactions of social and natural hazards can make the impacts much more destructive than envisaged. We must therefore use integrated approaches, targeting risks across the triple nexus. Like the new research project Societies at Risk outlines, we must not only focus on occurrence and severity of armed conflict, but consider the broader picture, such as the extent to which people, livelihoods, and infrastructure are affected by armed conflict, and how well local populations can cope with armed conflict and other external shocks to the system. And like being in Rwanda at the moment, what we've been saying to the teams here is there's 120,000 refugees currently hosted in Rwanda, but given what's happening around the region, whether it be even in northern Kenya or Tanzania or the Congo or in Burundi, what will be the situation of 5 or 10 years' time? It's not only the potential violence, but what will be the vulnerability of populations? Is it likely to remain stable? Is it likely to deteriorate? Is it likely to improve? So it's not only about using data and this multidisciplinary research to react. It's about how do we start positioning ourselves to be much more prepared? How do we support investment and engagement in preparedness and adaptation? So the work that it may seem very academic to many of those people, many of you on the call, but for me, it's essential. We need to be using this data and evidence to be going to the World Bank, to be pushing for investments here, in pushing for collaboration with the private sector. So this is one of the reasons why we're so excited and interested in this. So the third message, so I'm winding up now, data-driven solutions like the New Societies at Risk project can help fill the gaps in the current UN solutions, and there's many, for assessing the risk of impending humanitarian crises, and can complement traditional analysis as one piece of that puzzle. And this is where we also need to be taking into account. No one has got the whole understanding or picture. What you're doing, what everyone is doing, has to contribute to a more complete understanding of the increasingly complex challenges that we've got. We need collaborative approaches and a transparent knowledge and data transfer. Challenges created by the triple planetary crises are increasingly cross-cutting and complex, and consequences will be felt and are being felt across all the sectors. Partnerships are the cornerstone of success. We must break down the silos of independent efforts and promote intersectional and interdisciplinary collaboration amongst the UN, NGOs, and academia, in which the outputs of one team feeds in the input of another team. And going to the reasons why I've probably been invited to speak is that we've actually undertaken a proof of concept which has demonstrated that we can get people to work together. And this relates to the Sahel Predictive Analytics Project, where it's been an unprecedented multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's been cited by the Secretary General as the best practice within the UN. And we're already seeing that even the draft report being used by key interlocutors in the Sahel to solicit a much more cohesive approach to development across the whole region. And so while the project aimed to enhance coordination on data and strengthen preparedness for the growing and interconnected risks across the triple nexus, what was the key outcome for me was not necessarily the results, but that we developed, or we supported, or we facilitated this global consortium of leading academic institutions who could work together in relation to areas of their specialty, whether it be armed conflict, whether it be climate change, whether it be other mega trends. And this then led to a better understanding of vulnerabilities, conflict, violence, and from my interest, potential displacement. So the Violence Early Warning System project from Uppsala has been one of the earliest. Yeah, so Views was one of three key partners that we brought on board. And once we brought Views on board, that then encouraged others to be on board. And so then we've now got 20 agencies, actors, centers of excellence. So it does demonstrate that if you get this center or power together, and you think ambitiously and you think in a collaborative manner and you think about how we can prevent rather than react, then there is traction out there. So what probably my closing message will be, the new research project, Societies at Risk, aims to address all of the outlined challenges. It has therefore the potential to become a best practice because you're building on what makes sense, and not only to support humanitarian work, but also to support that nexus with development, peace building, and human rights. The project offers the theoretical and methodological framework needed to quantify the expected negative consequences of recent and impending armed conflict. It has huge potential to offer objective risk assessments of humanitarian consequences of armed conflict. And in conclusion, I just fully support the research agenda. It is just what we've just got to continue to keep moving forward. And looking forward to working with the research team. We wish the project and its researchers and all our friends who are there all the best on this ambitious but essential endeavor, because the world is not going to become any more predictable or stable. So the more support in terms of understanding the challenges, looking at the various scenarios, which we can help inform policy and decision makers, the better. So best of luck. Thank you very much. There's probably not a more poignant place to be talking about this than in Rwanda. at the moment. So good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, so much for your strong messages here. It's really good also to hear how these kind of projects are important for the practice as well. As you said, it often seems like an academic research, but academic research can have a really strong impact in the field. So thank you for bringing this message to us from the field, and also emphasizing that it's not only about predicting the violence, it's also understanding the human costs, right? The impacts on human development, which is exactly what this new project, Societies at Risks, is about. So thank you again, Andrew, for joining us. We wish you safe travels. We know that you have to leave now, but thanks again for joining us. With that, I'm going to hand over to our first panelist today, to a person who many in the audience know through the VIEWS project, Professor Håvard Hegre, who is Dag Hammarskjöld Professor in Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, with nearly 30 years experience from peace and conflict research, political science, computer science and statistics, with this focus on relationships between democracy, development, and armed conflict, as well as on forecasting political events. Professor Hegre is currently working, as many of you in the audience know, on VIEWS project, but also starting this very exciting new initiative that he will be telling us more about right now. Professor Hegre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Branka, and thanks, Andrew, for your encouraging words. So I'll talk a bit about, I'll just lay out the framework for this presentation, talk a bit about the background for Societies at Risk, which is VIEWS, as has been mentioned already, and talk a bit about how we structure the Societies at Risk project and what the objectives are. So as Branka said, the background for this is VIEWS, a political early warning system, which has been developed at Uppsala University since 2017, with funding from the European Research Council. So VIEWS is a system to forecast organized violence. So currently we make forecasts for countries, every month, up to 36 months into the future. So what's the probability of a conflict in each country? And also for grid cells, a set of approximately 50 by 50 kilometer cells that are superimposed on the entire world, called PRIO-grid. So we forecast in the first version of VIEWS, we forecast the probability of armed conflict according to the USDP definition for all of these units. So we do this for 3 forms of violence as defined by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. So state-based violence is the most important form of violence. That's violence between a government and either another government or an organized armed group with a political motivation, but also violence by one such organization or a state against unarmed and unorganized violence, and conflicts between organized groups that are not states, so non-state violence. So this system performs well-established violence. We have published quite a bit of evaluation statistics showing how it works. Recently, we've been working with funding from the UN ESQA and from the UK Foreign Office, worked to expand this to the included Middle East and to make forecasts for fatalities, number of fatalities per month. So the map to the left here shows the predicted number of fatalities in each of these grid cells for August 2022. The line graph to the right shows the expected number of fatalities in 5 countries for each month over the next 36 months. You can see that we forecast about 500 fatalities per month, every month in Yemen for the next year, and then declining very, very slowly to an expectation of 300 per month at the end of 2024. But of course, this model, just as the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, is restricted to direct battle-related deaths. But we know that the impacts of conflict are much wider. Exactly how large the impacts are is not known. There is lots of claims about the proportion of civilian deaths to direct battle-related deaths, and that proportion has been changing over time. But there is a large need to quantify this relationship between direct battle-related deaths and the secondary impact much more precisely. So that's the background for this project. So what are the impacts of armed conflict? We'll hear more about that from the other panelists. So they include, but are not limited to, impacts on health and nutrition and mortality. They include economic effects, both for household and country. So the graph to the right here shows how the GDP per capita of Burundi followed the GDP per capita of Burkina Faso at that time, up to the 1990s. Both of these countries were peaceful. Then there was a serious armed conflict in Burundi, and the GDP per capita dropped conspicuously in Burundi, while Burkina Faso continued to grow at a much faster rate, along with other African countries. Access to safe water is another impact. There are impacts on mental health, on interpersonal trust. There are impacts on political institutions. And there is quite a bit of existing research on this, but they tend to be studied in isolation. So political scientists study institutions, economists study the economies, and public health specialists and epidemiologists look at the health effects. But that carries with it a risk of underestimating the risk, because these impacts often reinforce each other. So that's one motivation for what we will be doing here in this project. So and following up on what Andrew said, this is really research to support a call for action by quantifying the full impact of armed conflict. We want to provide decision makers with better information to argue for their cases, for conflict prevention, for conflict mitigation strategies, for all sorts of policies that are effective in reducing the suffering from armed conflict. And also, we hope to be able to identify some useful things to do in conflict situations to reduce the secondary impacts of armed conflict. So the program will make available a greatly enhanced capacity to quantify the expected negative consequences of recent conflicts that are going on, and also impending armed conflicts that we think are likely to happen or to escalate, on a range of human development outcomes. So we'll also develop a theoretically consistent framework for impact risk assessment across these outcomes, and a methodology to estimate the impact. So very quickly on methodology, we'll apply a risk formulation saying that the risk of some outcome is some impact function for the outcome as a function of hazard, which is the hazard is the observed conflict or the expected conflict, as we do in an expanded version of use, exposure, the extent to which a local population is exposed to this violence, and vulnerability, the extent to which the local population is able to adapt to these circumstances or to suffer the worst of the consequences. So we make a new formulation, exposure vulnerability. This is hard, so lots of questions like, how is communicable diseases in Nigeria affected by conflict in Mali? So there are spillover effects of the impact of armed conflict. It's how to model those. That's one of the questions we will be discussing. For how long will any impact affect the population? So the graph to the left shows that the excessive infant mortality is quite high for 7-8 years after the armed conflict event itself. What could have made the local population more resilient? We're using, as in views, use machine learning approaches to train, evaluate, and improve the models. So we will make an early warning system for impacts of war along the lines of the view system, but expanded to all these, to a set of outcomes. We will improve the understanding of the impact of armed conflict. We will be able better to model how conflict affects outcomes across space, time, and social groups, and to better handle measurement, statistical, and specification uncertainty. So the support for this is coming mainly from a Riksbankens Jubileumsfond program, a Swedish funder. So great appreciation for their generosity to fund this project. Funding over 6 years, up to 2027, more than 30 person years of activity, and hosted at Uppsala University. There are also additional funding from the European Research Council and from the Swedish Vetenskapsrådet, the Swedish Research Council, and other sources. Cross-disciplinary team, so important aspect of this project is that we want to do this cross-disciplinary. So we have people from peace and conflict research, myself, Magnus Öberg, Jonathan Hall, Ashok Swain, Nina von Uxkull, and peace and conflict research is cross-disciplinary in itself. That's the definition of peace and conflict research. There will be people from public health and epidemiology. So Johan von Schreeb will hear from Debarati Guhasapir, Anneli Eriksson. From economics, Tilman Bruck, Hannes Müller will inform us about some of his plans for the project. Christoph Rau, political science, Michael Coloresi, myself, Staffan Lindberg. Social ecology, Jonathan Hall will talk to you. Climate change management, Paula Vesco, you'll also hear from her. And Nina von Uxkull again, and water management, Ashok Swain. So we have 6 discipline-specific work packages that will work to understand and quantify impact given exposure and vulnerability to armed conflict. So we really look forward to be able to work on this project for the next 6 years. So with that, I'll leave the floor to the specialist on the different outcomes and methods here. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor, for guiding us, especially making this connection between views and the societies at risk, emphasizing also that this is a cross-disciplinary project. We are lucky to have or you are lucky to have some of these researchers in person in the room now. So we will hear some of their previous research, but also their plans for their portion of the work in the framework of the societies at risk. So I will first introduce Professor Hannes Müller, who is a tenured researcher at the Institute for Economic Analysis and associate research professor at the Barcelona School of Economics. And his fields of interest are machine learning, political economy, development economics, conflict studies, and most recently, he has analyzed how political institutions can make societies more robust, the channels through which violence affects the economy, and how conflict can be predicted using millions of newspaper articles. Again, one of the forecasting projects that I'm sure is familiar to many in the audience today. It's a great pleasure, Professor Müller, to have you with us today. Please do guide us through the costs of non-intervention.
Thank you, Branka. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thank you for joining us here and online. So this is joint work with Christopher Rau and Alessandro Ruggieri. And it's building on actually something that I did for the Pathways for Peace report that was written for the UN in collaboration with the World Bank. And we have kind of expanded this with our research on conflict forecasting. And so kind of we want to bring this to the Societies at Risk project by expanding it along several dimensions. I'm going to be more concrete about, but I first want to present kind of the findings that we have up until now. It's based on an additional project for the FCDO. So the main trade-offs in conflict prevention, and you know, this is really en vogue right now to say we want to do more prevention. Andrew said it again, right? We want to go ahead of the curve and so on. But I think that the problem is that there is real trade-offs that are faced by policymakers when they want to engage in this direction. And the first problem is that I think what actually keeps us from doing it effectively is that if you want to intervene early in low-risk situations, you are bound to make mistakes because the forecasts are imprecise, and therefore you intervene in lots of places that actually didn't need an intervention, right? And this brings up the cost of an effective intervention per successful intervention. And the second factor is that if you intervene too late, if you wait it out until the risk crystallizes and becomes real and becomes actual violence, then you have a situation which is already violent and which has these dynamics that have been studied a lot, namely what's called the conflict trap. So countries are getting caught in repeated cycles of violence, and it's very hard to escape these repeated cycles, and that makes it very hard. And so as researchers, we are facing this trade-off, right? Do we want to warn early, and as policymakers also, do we want to intervene early? And so this model that we have developed is kind of trying to address this point. And I think there's some really stark messages that come out of it that I would like to talk about. So how is this model working? It's we call it the dynamic early warning and action model. And to do this, we first kind of define some conflict states through a forecasting model. It's based on the conflictforecast.org forecast. It's very similar to views. And we link these states to outcomes like growth, life expectancy, and displacement. So as the conflict evolves, the states will be higher and higher. And as it kind of explodes and becomes more intense, there is going to be very, very high states. So think of these as warning flags that are coming up. So in the beginning, if you're a very stable country, you have one warning flag and then they increase. The post-conflict piece is fundamentally different from pre-conflict piece, and that is a main kind of theme that we address in this project. Namely, we need to put the conflict trap center stage. So once you had an escalation of a conflict, you are in a fundamentally different situation than before the outbreak of a conflict. And so what prevention does is it puts you in a better state tomorrow. By not falling into the trap, you prevent yourself from rolling down that hill, right? If you have these old images that you know in physics of balls having higher energy levels high up, then this is what we want to do. We want to keep the countries and the populations in these places that are inherently stable and kind of keep them there, right? And so what we do is we try to generate a better future. And so to address this, we develop a model that simulates futures with intervention and without intervention. And so to kind of illustrate this in 1 minute, or I don't know how much I have, like 3 maybe, I just show you 2 figures, okay? The first figure is what you get when you map these states that we have inside the model to violence. So on the y-axis here, you see the amount of fatalities per month in these different states. And on the bottom, you see the states as we define them through the forecasting model. So state 1 is kind of where Sweden is most of the time, and Germany is most of the time, right? And 5 is where, for example, India is right now. And then you have the post-conflict states, and of course you see that it's not chronologically ordered, but these are states where countries are that recently had a conflict, and so that means they have very high risk of going back to conflict. And so this is where Indonesia is, for example. This is where the Philippines are, right? And then you have the conflict states. So these are states there is ongoing violence, and 5 minutes. Oh, great. Where there's ongoing violence, and so in these states you see that the death toll per month increases dramatically, right? So these are first low-scale conflicts and higher-scale conflicts, and then it goes all the way up to absolutely disastrous conflicts that on average cost 1,500 deaths per month. So if you take this image and you frame policy around that image, then the most urgent action should be taken in state 13, right? This is clearly, and rightly so. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that this is the idea you get from this image, that the most urgent action is necessary in state 13, right? So we need to save those lives. We need to make sure that somehow they don't die or that less people die. And this is exactly where the public health experts come in, because a lot of these people are not dying from the conflict directly, but in the broader context of it. So this is like a big focus of the world, actually. And then you might think, well, maybe we should prevent countries from escalating into these conflicts. And so maybe 12 and 11 and 9 and 10 are also relevant. But the other states, right, might not be that relevant. And I think this is exactly where kind of the thinking about the future is really, really relevant, because in states 8 and 7 and 9, 6, 7 and 8, you're very likely to go tomorrow in the next month into conflict. So therefore, if you're looking ahead and you're worrying about the future outlook, then the picture changes. And what I'm going to show you now is the result of combining different costs, different economic costs, but also human costs, and translating them into dollar values. I know that's it's a very strange exercise, but somehow we need to find one currency. And so I use GDP as a currency here. And what you see is that if you do these calculations and you think about the future and you think about what if I could intervene and I could prevent an escalation, where would I start doing that? And you see that there's a lot of benefits to doing interventions earlier than the previous picture indicated, right? So you see now clear benefits in stage 6, 7, and 8, but you also see benefits in the even earlier stages of stage 5. And so my takeaway here is that we need to think about this more systematically. We need to kind of take different factors into account for making these costs and making these calculations. And one thing that I also in the workshop I showed the other joint researchers is something that I think if you think about the overall cost of conflict, we just need to imagine peace. And in this way, we kind of know what it means that conflict exists. And if we listen to ourselves, I think the world will be much better. And this weight that is lifted from our shoulders when we imagine peace is the cost of conflict. And therefore, I think it's quite large. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. Thank you, especially for emphasizing this importance of understanding post-conflict, that post-conflict and pre-conflict stages are fundamentally different. So this will be a very important contribution of your team to the societies at risk. And thank you so much for keeping us on the time as well. I'm realizing that we are a little bit behind, so I will immediately give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Johann von Schrieb, who is a general surgeon and professor in global disaster medicine at Karolinska Institute. He has, for the last 30 years, worked as clinician and coordinator in disasters across the world, most recently in Ukraine for World Health Organization. And his research aims to improve healthcare and public health response to both conflict and natural disasters. Professor von Schrieb is bringing to the project one of these 6 disciplines that Håvard mentioned. So it's a pleasure now to hear about the impacts of armed conflict on public health and how, Professor Schrieb, your specific research will actually feed into this future Societies at Risk project. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Branka, and thank you for this opportunity to speak about the impacts of armed conflicts on public health. And I have my colleague Anneli Eriksson in the audience, so this is absolutely not myself, but it's a joint project. And both Anneli and we are based at the Department of Global Public Health at Karolinska Institute, where we have a research group on healthcare in disasters. And what we try to do is not only conduct research, but also, of course, educational activities to train the next generation of health staff, but also to provide policy support. And what was alluded to here initially is to do field work, to do secondments to agencies in conflicts, in natural disasters. And I just got back from working for WHO in Ukraine. And I think that will be a bit of the flavor of my presentation, which is the clinical reality out there. And finding the interdisciplinarity, not only between academics, but also between those that are out there working, trying to alleviate suffering in conflicts, and the WHO and other UN agencies. So I think when we speak about interdisciplinarity, it's across several fields. Interestingly, our Karolinska Institute, it was founded some 200 years ago because when Sweden lost the war against Russia, and this is in 1809, the King Carl XIII decided that the surgeons, they were not surgeons at the time, they were more the barbers who were doing these horrible operations, amputating limbs of the soldiers, that they were not doing a very good job. So he said, we need to train them to do a better job so my soldier survives. Because up to 30% of those that were affected by the war on the battlefield died of complications or indirect effects. And that's why Karolinska Institute was formed. So we try to carry this tradition a bit in our research and in our activities in the research group. So conflicts and health, what do we know? Well, I would like to do a presentation a bit on what we do know, but you will hear that there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. So, and I would like to maybe conclude that what do we need to know in order to act? And we heard here about interventions, and from my perspective will be very much of the health interventions that are needed in conflict areas. And that is what we will contribute to this project. So around 2 billion people live in fragile or conflict affected areas. And of course, there is a lot of varying exposure to the hazards that conflicts constitutes. And also we need to take into account pre-existing vulnerabilities, meaning that it will be different in low-income versus more middle-income countries. And I think Ukraine is a very interesting example illustrating that pre-existing vulnerabilities in terms of health and in terms of burden of disease and in terms of health system capacities to deal is an interesting example comparing with South Sudan or other conflict-affected low-income countries. And when we look upon conflict, of course, what normally catches our attentions are the direct health effects, these horrible images we see of people who are injured by bombardments. And that takes a lot of our attention. However, probably the greatest problem from the health perspective are the indirect health effects, and sometimes that's called collateral damage. We saw that even in Sweden during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of sort of planned surgery could not be carried out because the system was overburdened by COVID cases. And of course, this contributes to excessive mortality and morbidity that relates to the conflict. And there's a lot of papers that I have been trying to document the health effects, and I will not go into details, but so we don't start from zero. But very often these publications are sort of focusing on what has happened in terms of people who have died and the effects. And I think this project is interesting in the sense that we would like to go sort of upstreams and try to avoid and try to prevent that the effects of conflicts really kills people or get them severely disabled or so. So what do we need to understand? Well, I think first of all, we need to understand what are the currently the direct effects. And then, of course, it's the trauma, but it's also the mental health of having seen somebody being killed or having your house destroyed. And I think all of us can see the images from Mariupol, and you can just imagine what it is like from a mental health perspective to witness to having been underneath in these tunnels and not being able to go to find food, etc., and all those type of direct exposure because of the conflict. And of course, they affect both civilians and combatants, and also on top of that, we have the direct targeted attacks on healthcare, and healthcare providers, and I will come back to that. But then, of course, the bombing, the shelling, the gunshot wounds are also the direct effects that we see. In terms of trauma, I'm not speaking so much about mental health, but what does the trauma do? Of course, it kills people, yeah? And it creates a lot of complicated injuries, predominantly of the limbs. And this type of injuries require advanced care that is currently, I would say, to a limited extent available in Ukraine. So that's why a lot of these patients need to be transported, not only inside Ukraine to more safe areas, but also to other countries. and they create a lot of long-term disabilities. And then, of course, the mental health aspects are complicated and very challenging and difficult to sort of estimate and come up with a good cure for, because they are long-lasting. What are the indirect effects? Well, they are caused due to displacement and destruction of infrastructure, health facilities, insecurity, and also lack of healthcare staff that may have left or may have been injured or killed. And it affects, the indirect effects affect public health. And I think on terms of the first aspect here, lack of access to water, sanitation, that's something that's very clear in Mariupol now, where people actually die because they don't have access to safe water and food. So they are very vulnerable in that sense. And then outbreaks, of course, of diseases, diarrheal diseases, etc., may appear. And so that is a sort of an indirect effect on public health. But what is probably the greatest burden of disease currently in Ukraine are the limited access to primary and secondary healthcare because of the conflict. And that is predominantly for the non-communicable diseases. And this rarely comes into the front line of the newspapers, that somebody with diabetes don't have access to insulin, for example. Somebody with hypertension is not getting their medication, or somebody who has a stroke cannot get care or dialysis, etc. So this is something that is not very well studied, and we don't know how problematic it is. And then, of course, maternal health, communicable diseases, and trauma are also, or management of it remains an indirect effect. So what is the scale of this problem? I think something to highlight here is that mortality, which is often discussed, is not a good indicator, because that's the end of the story. We need to understand more of of the problem before it actually happens. And I think Håvard was talking about how much do we know about this? Well, for the direct effects, we know that for every person who dies, well, there's probably between 3 to 5 who are injured and need to be managed. Of the indirect effects, there's between 3 to 15 times more people die of the indirect effects. But this is something, of course, that this research project is going to look closer on. Can we understand more about the modalities and why people actually die because of lack of care for example, of non-communicable diseases? So we need to better understand the modalities of the indirect effects, and we need also better metrics, and this is something that we are going to work on. And I would just like to start or end with attacks on healthcare, that really this is something that must stop. And this is a map of Ukraine currently, and you can see all the bombardments and the attacks that we have, and how many people are affected currently, around 8 million people internally displaced. And we have something like 7,000 direct civilian casualties, and that metric doesn't tell us a whole lot about the situation, as I was indicated. Some 226 health facilities have been attacked all across the country, and at least 75 people working in the health sector have died due to attacks. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor von Schrieb. This is a really important aspect of the work that you're bringing to the project. And I just have to mention with your last point that the attacks, I think both physical and cyber attacks on health facilities needs to stop. And this is what we see as a new dimension of war in Ukraine as well, with the hospitals or other institutions being attacked in the cyberspace as well. And another point, while our next speaker is preparing to take the floor, just to make this connection, I think it's really important now with what Hannes presented and the importance of forecasting not only conflict, but pre-conflict and post-conflict phases. And now I'm thinking about the direct and indirect health effects, how this is important to forecast, not only for conflict stages, as we heard now about Ukraine, but also in so many other countries that are vulnerable in pre or post-conflict stages. Like I'm seeing all of these consequences happening in Sri Lanka, for example, with the crisis. So it's really good to see how different pieces of this work come together. Well, now a big welcome to our next speaker, Paula Vesco, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, another colleague joining us from the Uppsala University. And Paula has expertise in the construction of climatic indicators using real-time and seasonal forecasting weather data, and knowledge of the literature on climate variability and conflict, with a special focus on vulnerabilities related to agriculture and natural resources. For her postdoc, Dr. Vesco concentrated on conflict forecasting, including how information on climate change impacts could improve conflict predictions. She has extensive experience in data analysis and georeference data, and is familiar with machine learning, which comes extremely helpful in the part of the work that she will be doing for this specific project. So with this, Paula will guide us through the impacts of armed conflict on societal vulnerability. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Branka, and thank you, Andrew, for the address. I don't know if you left already, and thank you, everyone, for being here and joining us today. So what I'm going to focus is this concept that has been mentioned of societal vulnerability, and I'm going to guide you a bit through how we plan to address this concept and integrate it in the project, and what we know and we do not know so far. So this has been mentioned by previous speakers as well, but I would like to draw your attention to what do we know about the impacts of conflicts. And you see here a map comparing on your left the victims of the Syrian conflict from 2011 to 2015. And then, and of course, darker shades indicate a higher number of victims. And at your right, you see the impact or the change in the well-being of affected population before, so in 2008 compared to 2015. So what this study shows is that, of course, affected populations experienced a sharp decline in well-being, social, physical, mental well-being captured by these indicators. You have healthcare satisfaction, hope, respect, but there are also regional and group differences in the impact of conflict on these indicators. You see, for example, that rural Damascus, that was one of the regions or the governorate that experienced the highest death toll, has a sharp decline and has the worst decline in healthcare satisfaction. But then there is unexpected, maybe, heterogeneity in this impact. And for example, the Sueda, the governorate that was not so affected in terms of victims, has one of the worst decline in how people perceive respect, and this is a measure of life satisfaction. And so vulnerability is a paramount concept that we will apply in this project to try to understand why this is the case and why do we observe this variation in impacts over space, time, and among groups. And this is paramount because we've seen, and Andrew touched upon this, that the most severe humanitarian crises in the past decades have occurred in places that were hit by a combination of different types of events, natural and social, so climate change and conflict, for example, hunger crisis in South Sudan and Nigeria that occurred due to a combination of conflict and environmental stress. So we need to, and this is the plan of the project, we need to develop a theoretical and methodological framework to analyze these compound events in an integrated, interdisciplinary way. Otherwise, we risk to, the threat is that we will underestimate risks. And we think that vulnerability will help us explain and bring all these compound events together in a unified framework. Vulnerability is a concept that is borrowed or is very common in climate and natural sciences. It indicates the propensity to be adversely affected by a hazard. So in this case, conflict, but it can also be natural disaster, earthquake, and so on. And this is why it's useful, because it explains, given the same hazard, how different societies or groups are differently impacted by the same hazards. And it is a function of pre-existing conditions, and indicates how people, groups respond and are able to react to and cope to a shock. And for example, it's a function of access to resources, socioeconomic development, and many more that we'll see. So what we will try to do in this project is to address this very complex challenge of analyzing the relationship between armed conflict and vulnerability. We know that armed conflict has an impact on socioeconomic development, hunger. It can lead to migration, it can increase poverty, reduce education levels, and so on. And in turn, all these factors are some of the main drivers of societal vulnerability. So the risk is that societies end up in this trap of conflict, increased vulnerability, which in turn increases the risk of security implications again, and so on. And the main research questions of this vulnerability component are to understand how exposure to conflict affects vulnerability to other hazards. So for example, how exposure to conflict affects the capacity of a society to respond to a drought or a natural disaster. And second, we will try to investigate how vulnerability can condition or mitigate or exacerbate the impacts of conflict across various outcomes. So these are the goals, and I think this is also an indication of how this project can contribute and have an impact for the policy sector. Hopefully the goals and the results of the project will be to estimate this vulnerability component and link this estimate of vulnerability for each specific outcome. So, for example, vulnerability to health and diseases, vulnerability to economic costs, and so on. And in turn, how does conflict exacerbate the vulnerability of societies to other shocks? And how does all these compound events reinforce each other? This will enable us to identify and predict how vulnerability varies across groups and locations in post-conflict settings and against the counterfactual. So this is just a snapshot of why we think vulnerability, how we think of vulnerability in the program. And Håvard mentioned this, vulnerability is not only a function of what occurs here and now, but it also a function of spillover effects, of shocks that occurred in other locations and in past periods of time, and also of the impacts that conflict, for example, had in other sectors. So one hopefully useful output of this project for the policy sector is this composite vulnerability index that will measure and provide a unified score of vulnerability across various outcomes. So to conclude, I think being able to understand how conflict affects vulnerability to compound events and the capacity of societies to respond to other shocks is paramount to be able to inform policy actions and interventions that may be preemptive rather than only reactive. And hopefully we will be able with this project to inform and support initiatives that can help communities build adaptation and resilience and better integrated policies where intervention is needed to provide targeted assistance. Thank you.
My name is Jonathan Hall. I'm an assistant professor, as mentioned before, in the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. And I'm going to be talking today about the social psychological impacts of armed conflict. And you'll see how there is a lot of overlap between the different work packages, which is natural and I think of interest in terms of trying to really understand the overall impact of armed conflict. Though there's a lot of ways that we could be conceptualizing the social psychological impacts, but I wanted to focus on a concept that had a broad data coverage and that would be studied from a lot of different disciplinary perspectives. And so we're going to focus on social capital. And so here we're talking about the trust, norms of reciprocity, altruism, and participation in social networks, all of which facilitate coordinated action, collective action in society, and the psychological processes that facilitate it. So I don't really need to keep talking about this since it's already been discussed quite a bit today, but war is highly destructive, right? It destroys infrastructure. It disrupts institutions and markets that provide the foundation for livelihoods and well-being. It reshapes norms, undermines trust, and in the end, degrades social capital. At least this was the view that we were provided with from the literature up until around the late 2000s. But a new picture is emerging, and it's something that we need to grapple with in this project. So over the last decade or more, a number of studies have emerged across a variety of disciplines in economics and political science and so forth that are demonstrating the pro-social impacts of armed conflict. And so what we're seeing is across a variety of metrics from surveys and also behavioral measures in games, played in lab in the field experiments, we see increased knowledge about politics, the willingness to vote, the willingness to take on leadership roles, the willingness to participate in organizations, for example. Also pro-social behavior in games, such as more altruistic giving and more willingness to contribute to public goods. And this is a well-documented phenomenon and was synthesized by some of the leaders in this field in 2016. And what they left us with in that literature review and meta-analysis of this picture is that we see an elevation actually in pro-social behavior. So not a decline, but an elevation. And most likely, although the literature is a bit scant in this regard, it's probably in relation to participation in social organizations and community meetings and willingness to help others and so forth within their own communities, right? So it's a parochial phenomenon is what they suggest in that analysis, although the literature is was at that time a bit scant in that regard. So they're arguing there's an elevation in cooperation, but it's parochial, right? It's confined to the in-group. And so what they left us with is we know that this is happening, but we don't understand why, and we need to understand the mechanisms. And so today I'm going to try to provide a little bit of a framework for how we might think about those mechanisms, focusing specifically on the role of health, mental health in particular, although it can be expanded, I think, to other dimensions of health. And so another aspect that we should comment on is the last 6 years or so, though, has provided a lot more evidence, and we should revisit this meta-analysis because there's quite a bit of diversity in the findings now. And so we see that under some conditions, it seems, war can result in an undermining of social capital, and in other cases, an increase, and it can even undermine social capital within communities. So we need to understand why. And so I'm going to give you two perspectives. One is a kind of a functional view. So, exposure to violence, exposure causes stress, but stress leads to adaptive behavior. So when our conditions are changing, and when our environment is changing, our social institutions need to change. We need to change, for example, who we might trust or cooperate with, because it's going to be adaptive and functional. If you're in the midst of a civil war, it may be dangerous to trust strangers or members of antagonistic outgroups. So in that case, one's sense of identity and one's social world might shrink, right? Especially to those people, those networks on which they feel they can truly rely in that sort of troubling time. So this is a functional and adaptive process. In other words, it's a healthy process. And the literature refers to the psychological research that discusses this phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. So the idea that, not only can traumatic experiences lead to trauma and degrading of mental health, but in fact, people can actually bounce back, and not only bounce back from that, but actually experience gains as a result of their traumatic experiences. And while it's a bit counterintuitive, it also makes a lot of sense in the sense that, we can all think about ways in which the troubling experiences that we've had in our lives have actually helped us to be better people. It might have encouraged us to, for example, have a better perspective on our life and find a sense of meaning and purpose. Through struggling with those experiences, we might have found, our relationships to be more valuable. And we might find ourselves being increasingly concerned and empathic to the suffering of others because we experience that suffering ourselves. And so that kind of struggling with those traumatic life crises can lead to a sense of growth. But this is questioned in the literature, and in particular in clinical psychology. Some are arguing that, well, maybe this is actually just capturing a previous resilience, that the individuals that are describing themselves as having post-traumatic growth maybe were simply more psychologically resilient and robust prior to the treatment of violence, and that we might be missing something. And especially if you describe this picture to clinical psychologists, they seem puzzled and think, well, I also study people who have had traumatic experiences, and what they tend to find is a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of post-traumatic stress, right? And that war exposure, when it leads to these types of mental disorders, really undermines social functioning, right? So when we are depressed or suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, we might treat our partners differently in our marriage. We might it might shape the way we interact with our friends or our willingness to engage in our local community. So it can really, it changes the way we might treat our children, right? And you can imagine the dysfunction that can result from struggling with those mental disorders, right? So of course, war exposure, especially if it's chronic and severe, it can lead to mental dysfunctions and social dysfunction. And this is clear from the research in clinical psychology. And so we can already see that there is a pattern that we need to understand. What explains these differing mental health trajectories? It's crucial to understand the impact of war exposure. And so here we have an interdisciplinary project where we're trying to understand not only the impact of war exposure on mental health and social capital, but the moderators of that process. What are the conditions that enhance the impact of war exposure on stress, right? Making it more severe. And what are those conditions under which, for example, people might end up in a more resilient state in the aftermath of war exposure? What promotes mental health in the midst of armed conflict, and what undermines it or degrades it? And so Andrew Harper mentioned, for example, and others have discussed the interaction between drought in particular and the food crisis that can result in, and its effects, how it can exacerbate the effects of armed conflict. And I'll just mention some very preliminary results that might be very intriguing. They're not yet published, but it's interesting and maybe suggestive of one of these links in this chain. So this is the relationship between war exposure and post-traumatic stress symptoms in a sample of refugees from the wars in Syria and Iraq residing in Turkey. And what you can see is that there is a difference depending on whether or not they've experienced drought in their area of origin. And those that have experienced drought, this is where you see a really steep incline. When they're more exposed to armed conflict, they experience greater post-traumatic stress. But if they live in areas that are not experiencing drought, then they seem more psychologically resilient. And so it's suggestive of what we might be finding throughout this project, is that there are these interactions that are really crucial to understand the patterns that we're seeing, that we're trying to understand. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan Hall, and also thank you to Dr. Paula Vesco, and my apologies for losing the connection for a couple of minutes. I'm back now and ready to guide us to the questions and answers part of our discussion today. So first, I will invite our Zoom audiences to think about their questions, to raise their virtual hand, and also once I give them the floor, to unmute themselves and also turn on their camera so we can spotlight them for the audiences in the room and on the Zoom. And while I give some time for our audience to think about their questions, maybe I can kick off with the first one. Again, a huge thank you to all of our speakers today for introducing their previous work and also their plans for the future contributions to the societies at risk. And maybe if some of you can tell us a little bit more about the concrete outputs from this project, about either reports or publications or forecasts that you are planning to prepare as part of this project. What can our audience expect to read or see in the future?
Thanks. Maybe I should respond to that. Yes, so this is an academic project, so we will certainly be publishing peer-reviewed academic articles. That's important to have the quality control for what we're doing. So that's going to be the first principle of a project like this, is to make sure that we have the certification from the academic community that what we're doing makes sense. We will also be another core output will be the forecast. So we'll make that available on a website. So we already have a website set up, viewsforecasting.org, which presents the views forecast. We'll expand that to make available the forecast for the impacts at the point when we get to make them in a shape that is publicly available. Also, we will also make available reports that explains the methodology, that explains why we see what we see in this forecast, and try to make some policy briefs for a broader audience and for policymakers.
Thank you, Håvard. This sounds great. Thanks for sharing this. I also shared some of the links in the chat for our audiences, and we will make sure to also include this in the event description once we publish the recording. I will invite again our Zoom audience. I don't see any hands, but if you wish to ask a question, feel free just to unmute yourself, to turn on your camera and to ask your question. And if we don't have yet any questions from the Zoom audience, I will pass to our in-person audience at Uppsala University, and maybe we can collect a couple of questions, either aimed to a specific guest speaker or to the entire panel.
Yes, so my name is Magnus Wahlberg, and I'm actually part of the project, but I'm curious to know if Johan von Schreeb has any sense of the size of the impact on non-communicable diseases, the thing that we know less about, because it's a thing that I hadn't thought about before you talked about it the other day.
I was working seconding the World Health Organization in Ukraine, and last week there was some report, and I've actually tried to find it, but they said 3,000 people is sort of been taken out of from the air. But if you think about the injuries that are a few thousand, but here you have 40 million people, and a lot of them elderly populations, they are stuck in their houses, they haven't been able to leave, the healthcare staff has left. So I think those challenges are enormous. And one question is that's on the agenda is how to get the medications to the people. And they've used postal services and different ways to actually reach this elderly population where their younger generation, children or neighbors may have left, so they're totally left. On top of that, you have the displacement of 8 million people, overburdening the health sector in the non-affected area. We have to remember around 60% of the country is unaffected and works where people sip cafe latte and watch Netflix and live a more or less normal life, even though there are these alerts of bomb alarms where you have to go into the basement. Still, you can have sort of a normal life. So when people ask me what's the situation like in Ukraine, it's you can't give one answer to that. There are certain areas, especially in the front line, extremely affected with conflict injured, where also most of the population has left, but some of the elderly left. And then you have some areas, maybe 20% that are under hard pressure and also with the health sector not functioning. But I would say around 60% of the country functions relatively normal, but are overburdened also. So, and this remains a challenge because, the outside world is a knee-jerk reaction to send medications, but nobody knows where to send the medications, and there are a lot of boxes in the hospitals. A lot of the hospitals I visited, there were a lot of medications, but they were in boxes in the basement, and when there were lack of propofol, which is a drug for doing surgery, they were probably in some of these 1,000 boxes downstairs, but nobody knew how to find it. And so there's a lot of challenges here, but to give you a number or like that is impossible. But I think we need to highlight the non-communicable diseases because that's the main burden of disease, but nobody really thinks about it. And so we launched also a number of mobile clinics to try to reach these areas and also to bring medications and to rather than prescription, actually hand out medications so they can last for a month or so. But this is not, the normal type of response capacity that we're used to. So I think it's something that I hope also this project will bring and to share that experience, because it's really a societal cost of conflicts that we need to be better on addressing.
If we have any more questions from the audience in the room, feel free to take the floor.
Hi, Anna Source at Center for Health Crisis, Karolinska Institute. Thank you so much for very interesting presentations. I was wondering a bit about data sources for the predictions. Obviously, you mentioned that the kind of combined risks of different vulnerabilities, et cetera, and how they interact with each other exacerbates the situation. And I understand, obviously, the conflict database is there. There's also prediction from like newspaper sources, but are there other sources of data that you're going to be using for trying to estimate these model parameters to get a better prediction? And the second question is, roughly what is the predictive value of the model if you're looking at historical data and predicting conflicts at this time? Thank you.
Okay, so for the conflict prediction, we use a range of sources. Most important is the constant monitoring that the Uppsala Conflict Data Program is doing, because that's the most important data source. It's also the source for validating the model. We also have data on protests, from the ACLA data set, riots and repressive actions by governments. We have data on structural factors. We are incorporating some models, reading large news sources, the work by Hannes Müller. For the outcome-specific forecast, we will be, I mean, this is still early, so exactly what are the best indicators is part of the research, but we will be making use of compiled data on various outcomes like economic data. We will be using quite a bit of survey data on households, on their education, on health, and try to put together a comprehensive or an uniform image of the situation for each outcome across the geographical areas that we're covering. So various surveys will be very important. The predictive performance of the system. So the views model is really good at predicting continued conflict. We can, if we accept 30% false positives, we can predict 95% of the country level cases, months with at least 25 fatalities. And we also can, there's quite good precision in terms of direct fatalities in conflict when they reach a certain level. The success in predicting conflicts that are currently at very low level is much poorer, and that's partly because it's an intrinsically really hard problem to predict conflicts in places where there is no conflict. So we hope to use the news source data to improve some of that, and also are doing other improvements. But it's challenging because we know quite a bit about probably the 20 most dangerous countries that don't already have an armed conflict, and they have a high latent risk of conflict. But the underlying probability of conflict erupting is quite low. So it might take 3-5 years before that conflict emerges, and then it's really hard to validate the performance of it. And it's the underlying risk is so low that it's really hard to show that the list of 20 most dangerous countries is correct. So that's one challenge in what we're doing. We hope to improve that and bringing uncertainty estimates so we can see that, well, the range of likely fatalities in this country is well, the most likely prediction is 0 fatalities, but then we see that there is a non-negligible probability that this will exceed 100, maybe 1,000 deaths. So some kind of volatile situations.
Thank you, Johan and Håvard. I see that we have another question on Zoom, so I will use my moderator role to maybe switch the conversation to Peter Rowan.
Thanks for this event. This has been really fascinating. It sounds like a really exciting project. So the questions were, the first is broad, which is, I wonder if you could speak a bit more. It's interesting to hear about these individual projects. It would be interesting to hear more about how you'll bring them together beyond just applying the forecasting. Will there be interdependencies between the different modeling approaches? Yeah, be interesting to hear more about that. The second, which is more specific, is that here at the Foreign Office, we're increasingly looking at the impact of conflict-related sexual violence, which is something that's often underreported, and we're interested in both monitoring of it and early warning of it. I wondered if there's any scope or interest in bringing that under any of the work streams. As to note, I don't know if you heard the first part, I just wanted to mention that we've been working with Håvard and Hannes over the past year. Their work has been fantastic, and I just wanted to say thank you to them while I have them on the stage.
Thank you, Peter. I will pass to the panel if somebody wants to respond.
Okay, I'll take that one too. Well, first, thanks to Peter and for the UK Foreign Office for funding the research we've been doing for the past few months, and that goes for Hannes too, I think. So it's been really great experience to work with you. So how to bring all this together? So I showed you the risk model. So we will be modeling hazard. So which is the observed and the expected armed conflict. So that's the views, and then we'll develop models for how a local population is exposed to that violence in the same location, but also in other locations and back in time, and also link that with data on vulnerability. So for each of these outcomes, we will model for instance, excess mortality as a function of the observed and also the expected violence and the population that is exposed to this and the vulnerability. So we will apply a kind of the same approach and same formula to try to estimate this outcome, the excess outcome, if you like, for each of them. And we'll also try to model in how the impacts for different outcomes reinforce each other. So an impact of armed conflict on access to water is very likely to also increase the impact of armed conflict on diseases, for instance. So model the impacts on each outcome as a function of both, also as a function of the modeled impact on other outcomes. So that's the joint modeling efforts. Then of course we'll be working in each work packages on the try to understand the causal pathways from armed conflict to each outcome and communicate on that more in the standard academic fashion. So try to learn from each other how these different how we can learn from other fields, how, for instance, from the water field to the epidemiology field, how these impacts reinforce each other. I think I missed the second question. So you can say that, yes, sure.
So Peter, you'll be happy to know that people liked what we developed for you guys. So I think that there will be some putting together stuff with the kind of optimal intervention model as well, and we try to now integrate this partly also with the evidence that comes from the micro studies, right? I think that the health effects are very broad and hard to track at the macro level, and so therefore we would try to integrate surveys and the micro studies that will be done for the project as well, and integrate them into kind of the more macro-ish models that we have. And at least for my part of the project, we will try to put all of this together in the kind of optimal decision model that we developed for FCDO. So I think that will definitely be one of the outputs, I hope at least, of the societies at risk as well.
Thank you both for your responses. I will give the floor to the next speaker now on Zoom, Hector Morales.
Hi, thank you very much for this enlightening and presentation of the project. It's really a promising project. And so I'm a researcher at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and I am doing research on monitoring and evaluation of environmental peace building interventions. And we are now building, also working with FAO, building some climate peace pathways. And so I was wondering if you have already exchanged with the UN agencies to integrate the conflict dimensions on early warning systems and anticipatory action, in which you have talk about the challenges to integrate these. This because my perception is that some agencies which mandate is more based on environment and for example, the fields of agricultural production, etc., are somewhat reluctant to integrate the conflictive dimensions, because this could also bring some kind of risks for communities when there is conflict, like armed actors. So I don't know what are your thoughts about it, to if you have seen these challenges and to overcome these challenges, to integrate the conflict dimensions into these early warning systems. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Excellent question. Yes, we've been collaborating with some UN organizations that are really interested in incorporating them. So the UN ESCWA has been developing together with us a dashboard where they make available information. They make our predictions available for the region that they're covering, and they use this in their dialogues with stakeholders in the region actively, and then they're very interested in not only the predictions that we develop, but also the explanations of the predictions. So we're trying to develop, try to the best of our ability, say that, well, this risk to be identified here is mainly driven by past conflict, or is mainly driven by poor governance or whatever, so that they can use that as information in their activity. So, and there is a very clear increasing interest in the UN system and also in Ministry of Foreign Affairs to use this kind of quantitative conflict risk assessments in their work. So, but that development has been going on over the past 5 years. So very big change since we started up with views 5 years ago. But of course, there is some resistance, in particular agencies. There are some of these agencies that they make their own risk assessments, but they don't want to make them publicly available because that would affect their operations. So I think also some of the benefits of doing what we're doing is to be out there as a public academic neutral benchmark for the internal risk assessment activities that organizations do. They can see what we produce, they can compare with their own assessments, and then they can evaluate based on that. I think that's also a valuable contribution, but we don't see that contribution. I know from talking to those that are active in the early warning sections in various organizations that they indeed do that.
Okay, hello. I'm Henrik Karlsson, Stockholm Environment Institute. Thank you so much for in an interesting way describing the project. I have two questions, one more on the methodological side and one more speculative perhaps. On methods, decision making was briefly mentioned, but I was curious about if there are any more components on decision making in the project. The reason I'm asking is that many of those decision making frameworks under deep uncertainty are tightly linked to how you frame scenarios. If you work, for example, with individual forecast versus working with ensembles of scenarios. And on the more speculative side, I know your geographical focus is on Africa and perhaps Middle East, but it would be interesting to know how easy it would be to transfer your methods and collecting data on some more high-profile potential conflict areas like North Korea and Taiwan. Thank you.
I can answer to the second, and maybe Hannes can take the first. Yeah, the intention during this 6-year period of the Societies program is to expand the model to have global coverage. As I said, it's very challenging to predict violence, the emergence of violence in places where there is no conflict, and it's really challenging to predict interstate conflict because they fortunately have been very rare over the past 30 years. So we're mainly using the detailed data from the USDP over the past, since 1990 and onwards, to train our models. So over that period, there hasn't been much interstate conflict. So that's really hard to do with these methods. I think qualitative assessment is probably more useful for that. So, but then I'll pass over to Hannes for the first question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so the framework we have developed is for FCDO. It should be seen as a kind of toolbox more than like this is done and therefore you should believe what we are saying, kind of thing, because it is actually very hard to find quantitative measures worldwide. So the conflict forecast webpage actually is already worldwide, and we're doing monthly forecasts. We use that to do also all over the world intervention predictions. But we always model an abstract prediction. And the prediction we are modeling is a 5% or 10% reduction of the escalation risk. So put yourself into the shoes of like you're somewhere in one of those states and you're wondering what would happen into the long time future if now I had an intervention that would reduce the risk of an escalation by 10%. And then we kind of simulate the world forward. So it's a mix between a kind of scenario planning and kind of like a forecast exercise. And so in this way, we are able to say, what if you intervene earlier? What if you intervene later, right? So I'm showing you all these bars, but they are kind of, in a way, they're all estimated on the data, but the intervention part is actually completely abstract. There is no underlying knowledge about how this intervention would work versus this intervention. They're all just percentage numbers of reductions of escalation. And this is important because the bars I was showing you did not take into account the costs of these interventions, right? And these costs might be much lower in the early phases of a conflict versus, you know, going in a very I mean, think of Ukraine right now, right? So there is intervention to reduce harm, but there's certainly no plan to intervene in a way of stopping the conflict right there, right? So it's too costly.
Do we have any more questions?
No, thank you so very much for the great presentations and all the information you've provided so far. My main question would be a quick one. I was wondering, because you mentioned especially the fact that the project will also look into the exposure to conflict of individuals, like of the societies, of course, and how it impacts their vulnerability. So I was wondering if there's also going to be some sort of disaggregation, especially in relation to the age or gender. I mean, it could be too ambitious, of course, but it would have immense humanitarian implications in terms of intervention into the, you know, situation on the field. So if we're going to, and especially considering that people from different backgrounds or ages and genders could have different levels of vulnerability as well. So thank you. That would be it.
Thank you. This is a very good point. So to the extent possible, we will be able to do it, and we will use data sources that are disaggregated by gender and age or other groups that may be relevant to vulnerability. We know that gender is one of the main vectors of vulnerability, and so one challenge, I guess, is data availability. So not all the sources provide information on gender, especially at the geographic level, right? So that's one challenge that we may be able to solve with the survey data. But this is definitely the plan, to include information on gender, age, socioeconomic groups, because these are the main drivers of vulnerability.
Hello, sorry for making your evening longer. But since we have such a quite broad interdisciplinary field and also quite a lot of experience here, I'm asking myself, I guess, a lot of the data you get for the whole studies you do for your projects is also based on fieldwork. And what is quite not on conference quite often not a topic, but that would be interesting to hear some point of view is how do you get what is your experience, your point of view in working on the field, in about own positionality, in how far do you go in interview, like a little bit more about that, because I think it's in different conferences in peace and conflict studies not yet a very big subject, but maybe research ethics in this direction it should.
Maybe I should ask my colleague Anneli, who will be, no, but we have included some qualitative studies that will be done with in affected countries and try to understand more about modalities and what I try to talk about, you know, what does the path look like, and maybe not to mortality, but in terms of losing access to healthcare, etc. So definitely qualitative studies are important here.
Maybe I can just conclude the event, and I would like to thank our hosts at Uppsala University and the entire team behind Societies at Risk project for organizing this event, introducing the research, letting us know what will be happening in the next 6 years. Special thanks to Angelica and the entire team at Uppsala University for making sure that everything functions behind the scenes. And special thanks to our audience as well for joining us both in person and on Zoom, and for contributing with great questions and comments. To the Societies at Risk team, we wish you all the best with the implementation of the project. I'm sure this community of practice waits eagerly to see the first results of the project. And again, to learn more and to keep up to date about the project, please do visit the project websites that Håvard mentioned. I put some links in the chat as well. Please do keep in touch with Societies at Risk work as they continue to advance their research and publish their findings. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.